It started like any other Senate hearing, a room full of tired faces, guarded tones, and scripted jabs. Cameras rolled, journalists tapped out pre-written blurbs, and senators on both sides prepared to rehearse the same talking points that had dominated headlines for weeks. But no one expected what happened next. But before we dive into this story, I want to hear from you. Comment down below, where in the world are you watching from? Let's light up this comment section. And hey, if you love stories with high drama, power shifts, and the kind of moments that leave people speechless, you're in the right place. Tap that subscribe button right now. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we drop the next chapter in these powerful, untold stories. When Congressman Adam Schiff leaned into his microphone and aimed a cold stare at Senator John Kennedy, the room tensed. Then came the blow. "You, Senator, are nothing more than a thug in a suit." The words echoed through the chamber, audible gasps, fidgeting staffers, even some of Schiff's allies exchanged uncertain glances. No one moved. No one spoke. And then, quietly, Senator Kennedy leaned forward, tapped the mic once, and uttered one word. "Interesting." The atmosphere shifted. "I've been called worse," Kennedy began, his voice steady and low. "But you know what I haven't been called? Out of touch." He looked directly at Schiff. "Not by the people back in Louisiana, who write to me every week asking why it feels like Washington's turned into a reality show with no prizes, just consequences." He reached into a folder and pulled out a worn piece of paper. "I got a letter last week from a single mother. Her name's Carla. She's working 2 jobs, barely keeping the lights on, and she still can't afford her daughter's insulin." He held the paper up slightly. "You want to talk about thugs, Congressman? Try explaining to a kid why her mom has to skip meals so she can stay alive while some of us are out here doing interviews in GQ." A few senators shifted in their seats. Schiff's face tightened. Kennedy continued, unwavering. "And I know it's easy to turn this into a stage, turn the rest of us into props, but I didn't come here to pose for cameras. I came here to serve." He unfolded a second note, handwritten, smaller. "This one's from an 11-year-old girl. She asked me why the people who make the rules live so differently than the rest of us." He paused. I didn't have an answer. The room was silent. "I may be a lot of things, Congressman," Kennedy said, looking straight at Schiff, "but I haven't forgotten who I work for." What happened next took minutes, but the impact was instant. On social media, clips of Kennedy's calm reply went viral. Commentators scrambled to reframe the moment, but most agreed this wasn't politics as usual. This was something else. Kennedy hadn't yelled. He hadn't insulted back. He'd held up a mirror. And Schiff was the one left staring into it. The hearing hadn't even adjourned, but the momentum had already shifted. Chairman Durbin tried to push forward, his voice slightly trembling as he called on the next speaker, but it was obvious no one was listening. All eyes were still on Kennedy. Even Schiff, now quieter than usual, adjusted his glasses and avoided eye contact. He looked down, scribbling notes that didn't seem to mean anything. Then, in an ill-timed attempt to regain ground, Schiff leaned into his mic and tried to reclaim the narrative. "I won't apologize for calling out extremism," he said, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "Senator Kennedy knows exactly what he's doing when he stokes outrage among his base. That's not leadership, it's manipulation." It was meant to sound firm, but instead it came off defensive. Forced. And Kennedy? He didn't respond immediately. He just sat still, letting the room feel the weight of Schiff's words. The tension grew heavier. Then Kennedy spoke again, still measured, still calm. "You just called everyday Americans angry and manipulated. That's what we've come to, huh?" The room stirred again. "You live in a city where thousands sleep on sidewalks and children dodge needles on the way to school. But sure, lecture the rest of us from your penthouse podium." The murmurs turned to murmurs of reflection. A few senators on Schiff's side shifted uneasily, unsure how to react. Kennedy leaned forward again. "You want to talk manipulation? You promised transparency. Instead, you've tucked away more documents than you've shared. You've hidden behind closed-door meetings while the public begged for answers." He wasn't yelling. He wasn't flailing. That was the unnerving part. He didn't need drama. His words, plain and sharp, hit harder than any performance. Across the room, Schiff tapped his pen against the table, his eyes darting toward his aides. They had nothing, just tight lips and furrowed brows. And Kennedy kept going. There are people in my district who don't give a damn about committee hearings. They care about gas prices, fentanyl in their schools, and whether groceries will break them before payday. The chamber was still. Schiff had aimed for a headline and instead had ignited something deeper. This wasn't personal anymore. This was political oxygen, a moment that people felt in their bones. Outside the chamber, headlines were already spinning. Kennedy flips the script. Schiff's jab backfires live. Within 30 minutes, the clip had more than 500,000 views. Comment sections exploded. This is how you answer an insult with truth. Finally, someone said it. And inside the room, as the next senator began to speak, it was obvious. Almost no one was paying attention. Because Schiff hadn't just sparked an argument, he'd lit a fire he couldn't control. Reporters swarmed the hallway before the hearing was even over. Microphones, cameras, and smartphones waited just outside the chamber doors, hungry for quotes. But neither Kennedy nor Schiff stepped out. Not yet. Inside, the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Kennedy quietly gathered a few pages from his folder and passed them to a clerk. He leaned back in his chair, composed as ever. The room assumed he was finished. He wasn't. "Just one more thing," he said, raising a finger. The room froze. Even Chairman Durbin, who had been trying to regain control, didn't object. Schiff turned slightly toward Kennedy but avoided direct eye contact. Kennedy held up a printed page. "This is a report from the Los Angeles County Council," he said, his voice level. "It shows over 75,000 people are living without shelter. That's more than the population of entire towns in my home state, and that number keeps going up." He let the silence breathe. "And yet," he continued, "we're told this is progress. We're told this is leadership." He placed the paper down gently on the table. "People back home, they're not watching C-SPAN clips, they're watching grocery prices. They hear you calling me names, Congressman, but they don't hear you explaining how that helps them afford medicine." The weight of his words hung heavy. A few members squirmed in their seats, not out of offense, but reflection. Kennedy had pulled the room out of the echo chamber and back into reality. Schiff, clearly frustrated, spoke again. "Well, maybe if your party spent less time with sound bites and more time negotiating in good faith." But Kennedy didn't even let him finish. "Negotiating with who?" he asked calmly. "The consultants, the lobbyists, the advisors behind closed doors. That's not negotiation, that's performance." That line hit harder than any insult. "You call me a thug," Kennedy added, "because I speak directly to the people. Because I won't soften my voice while this place buckles under its own weight." He stood slowly, collecting his folder. "I don't pretend to be perfect, but I do walk into every diner, every school, every VFW hall in my district, and I look folks in the eye." He paused. "Can you say the same?" For a moment, no one moved. Finally, the chair muttered, "We'll recess for 10 minutes. Still, the room didn't stir. Kennedy stepped out, walking through the hall with the quiet confidence of someone who knew he'd just said what needed to be said. Reporters surged toward him. He waved them off. "I'll speak in a bit," he said. "Let the room breathe first." Back inside, Schiff didn't leave his seat. He just stared at the table. The insult he'd launched for applause had become something much bigger, something real. And the nation was already watching. Outside the chamber, the media frenzy erupted. Cable news broke into scheduled programming. Commentators flipped through notes, unsure how to frame what had just happened. One clip played again and again, Kennedy holding up a crumpled letter and saying quietly, "I didn't have an answer." It wasn't fiery, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And that's what made it powerful. Meanwhile, Schiff sat huddled in a corner of the chamber with two aides. They whispered urgently, reviewing notes, their phones lighting up with live reactions. One staffer leaned in and muttered, "Let it pass." But Schiff wasn't listening. He stared at his tablet, scrolling through the trending tab. His name was everywhere, for all the wrong reasons. Then, against his team's advice, he stood and walked toward the press entrance. The hearing was still in recess, but reporters spotted him immediately. They opened a path. "I stand by what I said," Schiff declared. "I won't apologize for defending democracy against inflammatory rhetoric." The delivery was forced. His voice tried to project confidence, but something in his expression betrayed uncertainty. A reporter jumped in with a pointed question. Do you think calling a fellow senator a thug helps defend democracy? Schiff hesitated. The smirk that had accompanied his earlier insult was gone. Well, I think sometimes people need to be called out when they're out of line, he said. But the moment had already passed. The damage had been done. Because while Schiff was fumbling for control, Kennedy wasn't talking. He was listening. In a moment that would later be captured on someone's phone, Kennedy was seen in the hall shaking hands with staffers, janitors, and interns. No cameras, no team pushing him. Just a senator moving through a building filled with people who often go unnoticed. And someone recorded it. That video went up within the hour. The caption read, "Kennedy doesn't talk down, he walks with them." By the time Kennedy approached the press for his official remarks, the clip was already viral. He stepped to the microphone, still holding a few pages in his hand, and adjusted it carefully. "I didn't come here today to argue," he began. "I came to speak for people who are usually ignored. I don't have time for performative politics." He pulled a note card from his jacket pocket. "It's from my grandfather. Says, don't raise your voice, improve your argument. I try to live by that." He let the words settle. "I won't return personal attacks, but I will keep telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it is." There was no applause line, but people clapped anyway. Reporters, staffers, even a few onlookers in the corridor. And then, as Kennedy turned to walk away, someone shouted one final question. "Do you consider Senator Schiff a friend?" Kennedy paused, then said, "I consider him a reminder." And with that, he left. By mid-afternoon, the confrontation had gone global. YouTubers, TikTokers, and political commentators from both ends of the spectrum couldn't stop talking about it. The moment dominated every feed, every screen, but the momentum was clearly in Kennedy's favor. Schiff's insult was still being replayed, but only as a setup for Kennedy's quiet, decisive response. Side-by-side comparisons filled Twitter and YouTube. Schiff shouting versus Kennedy speaking, Schiff accusing versus Kennedy reading a child's letter. And the contrast was brutal. Back in the Capitol, Kennedy's office line rang without pause. Constituents left voicemails, emails poured in, and even a handful of Democratic senators reached out, not to argue, but to admit Schiff had crossed a line. Meanwhile, Schiff's office was in damage control. The mood was tense, and no one had answers. One aide suggested releasing a clarification. Another warned that any further statements would only dig the hole deeper. But Schiff had already made another call, this time to a producer at a major news network. He wanted to go live. He thought he could control the story again. That evening, Schiff appeared in a brightly lit studio, seated across from a familiar anchor. "Senator Schiff," the host began, "you called John Kennedy a thug today on live television. Do you regret using that word?" Schiff shifted in his seat. "I regret that the conversation shifted away from policy and toward personal drama," he replied, dodging. "But would you use that word again?" There was a pause. "Maybe not that exact word," Schiff said, "but the sentiment stands." And just like that, the clip was clipped, captioned, and uploaded before the segment even ended. It didn't sound strong. It sounded like deflection. The internet called it what it was, backpedaling with pride. Meanwhile, Kennedy wasn't sitting in a studio. He was back in Louisiana, hosting a town hall. There were no production lights, no script, just folding chairs, local families, and more people than expected. Staff had to bring in extra seating. The energy in the room wasn't political, it was personal. At one point during the Q&A, a woman stood and asked about what happened in D.C. Kennedy nodded slowly. "I didn't plan to go viral," he said. "I planned to tell the truth. And sometimes, truth stings folks who haven't heard it in a while." The crowd clapped. Not loud, not theatrical, but sincere. Then, from the back of the room, a teenager raised his hand. His voice cracked slightly. "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" Kennedy didn't blink. "All the time," he said. "But I never get tired of defending people who can't fight back." The clip was just 14 seconds long. By the next morning, it had 4 million views. Schiff had aimed for a headline. Kennedy had created a moment. And the nation wasn't just watching anymore. It was remembering. By Monday, the conversation had evolved. News outlets weren't debating who had won the exchange. They were dissecting what it revealed. Editorials asked pointed questions. Is Washington out of touch? Did Kennedy strike a chord? Did Schiff miss the moment? Even progressive commentators admitted the obvious: the insult had backfired. One journalist summed it up plainly: "You don't call a man a thug for reading a letter from an 11-year-old girl. You just don't." But Kennedy didn't dwell on any of it. He focused on what came next. Back in his Louisiana office, Kennedy's team sifted through the hundreds of messages pouring in: emails from small towns, handwritten letters from veterans, voicemails from single parents, and then there was the call. It came in quietly. A staffer answered, thinking it was another constituent. On the line was Carla, the same single mother Kennedy had mentioned during the hearing. She hadn't expected to speak to him. She just wanted to say thank you. Kennedy picked up the phone. She was crying. "I didn't think anyone up there even knew we existed," she said. "But when you read my letter, you made me feel like I mattered." Kennedy didn't say much. He just listened. And when she finished, he said something simple: "You're why I ran." Later that day, Kennedy's team posted a short message on social media. No flashy banner, no dramatic music. Just white text on a black screen. Leadership isn't loud, it's listening, and it starts by remembering who you work for. That one post reached over 1 million shares before midnight. Back in D.C., Schiff's office was silent. The press had stopped calling, the cameras had moved on, and inside his circle, frustration boiled. Every attempt to shift the narrative had failed. The story had grown beyond him, into something he couldn't spin. Because at its heart, this wasn't about ideology, it was about authenticity. And Kennedy had it. He hadn't delivered a performance, he'd delivered a message. And while Schiff tried to bury it beneath talking points and carefully worded corrections, Kennedy had exposed something that cut through the noise. Truth doesn't need to yell. And when it speaks, people listen. As the week rolled on, Kennedy returned to the Senate floor, quietly, no fanfare, no press releases. He took his seat like it was any other day. But this time, something had shifted. Colleagues who once brushed past him now nodded in respect. Staffers from across the aisle offered subtle acknowledgments. Eye contact, slight smiles. Even those who hadn't agreed with him were now paying attention. Schiff, however, was absent. Officially, his office cited a scheduling conflict. Unofficially, insiders knew the truth. He was regrouping, uncertain how to re-enter a room that had moved on without him. Kennedy, meanwhile, wasn't interested in optics. He had work to do. During that hearing, he introduced a proposal: reallocate unused federal administrative funds to launch a pilot program for affordable insulin access. It was practical, targeted, grounded, and attached to it were letters, real ones. Carla's was among them. He didn't bring up Schiff, not once. He didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. While Schiff drafted press statements and monitored approval ratings, Kennedy was delivering results. Back in Louisiana, Kennedy's approval ratings surged, not just with Republicans, but independents and even some Democrats. Not because they suddenly agreed with him on every issue, but because he'd done what few politicians managed to do. He made people feel heard. Still, the media tried to bait him. They wanted a rematch, more drama. Another headline. In a brief hallway interview, a reporter asked directly, "Senator, would you call Adam Schiff your political enemy?" Kennedy didn't hesitate. "No," he said, "just someone who forgot who he works for." That clip was played again and again on evening broadcasts. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't smug. It was disappointing. And somehow that stung more. Because the story had stopped being about a spat. It had become a study in what leadership looks like when the cameras stop rolling. Schiff had thrown the first punch. Kennedy hadn't thrown one back. He'd redirected it, turned it into something meaningful, and voters noticed. On social media, a new phrase emerged: "Do it the Kennedy way." It became a rallying cry, a quiet protest against performative politics, a standard that said, speak with purpose, lead with humility, and don't forget who sent you. Schiff's name was still trending, but now it was as a warning, a cautionary tale about ambition that outruns accountability. Behind closed doors, Schiff's team held an emergency strategy meeting. The numbers were brutal. His favorability had dipped sharply, especially among moderates. Donors were going quiet. A planned fundraiser in San Francisco had been postponed twice. The clip of him calling Kennedy a thug was still circulating, but now it was featured in attack ads from both sides of the aisle. Meanwhile, Kennedy said nothing. No counterattacks, no viral tweets, no media blitz. He simply kept showing up. In committee meetings, he brought a simple folder filled with stories. Real letters, real names, real families. He passed them to staffers, colleagues, anyone willing to listen. And they listened. Even those once critical of him began to see a pattern. He didn't show up with outrage. He showed up with answers. He wasn't grandstanding, he was governing. Back in D.C., Schiff tried again. He posted a lengthy thread on Twitter warning about the dangers of populist rhetoric. It flopped. Replies flooded in with the same phrase, "Do it the Kennedy way." He followed up with a video message, polished, scripted, full of production value. It disappeared in hours, not because it was wrong, but because it felt like theater. Meanwhile, Kennedy's team posted a 43-second clip. No lighting setup, no script, just him sitting in a folding chair at a high school gym answering questions from teenagers. A student asked, "What do politicians get wrong most?" Kennedy smiled, leaned forward and said, "They talk too much and listen too little." That clip got over 6 million views in 2 days. It wasn't charisma, it was clarity. Cable shows started comparing Kennedy to the old-school senators of the past, the ones who didn't build their careers on outrage, but on understanding, and people took notice. Not just in Louisiana, but across the country. Because while Schiff scrambled to restore his image, Kennedy was doing something more powerful. He was building trust. And in Washington, trust is rare. By week's end, Kennedy's insulin proposal was scheduled for debate. Co-sponsors began to pile on, including 3 from across the aisle. Analysts were stunned by its bipartisan momentum. But Kennedy wasn't surprised. He had shown up to every meeting with the same message. This isn't about me. It's about them. He brought the letters. He read them aloud. And for the first time in a long time, people felt like someone in Congress was actually listening. And as the cameras rolled into the Senate chamber for the vote, it became clear. The man who had been called a thug was about to lead the most talked-about bipartisan effort in months, and he'd done it without raising his voice once. The Senate chamber was unusually full. Staffers stood along the walls, journalists filled the gallery, and even a few members of the public managed to slip into the back row. Something felt different. Everyone knew this wasn't just a policy vote. It was a referendum on leadership, on tone, on the kind of politics people wanted to believe in again. Kennedy sat near the front, that same note card still tucked in his jacket pocket, no fanfare, no cameras pointed his way. Just a quiet man holding a stack of letters. Some were from Louisiana. Others came from states he'd never even visited, Oregon, Ohio, Vermont. All said the same thing, "Thank you for listening." When his name was called, Kennedy stood slowly and walked to the podium. For a brief moment, the chamber went still. "This isn't a Republican idea," he said. "And it's not a Democrat idea. It's just an American idea, that no family should have to choose between food and medicine." He placed one letter on the podium. "This one's from a dad in Iowa. He lost his wife last year. Now he's raising 2 kids on his own. His boy is diabetic, can't afford insulin, not because it doesn't exist, but because this town forgot what it's like to struggle." He paused just long enough for it to sink in. No shouting, no finger pointing, just truth. He looked around the room, not defiantly, but honestly. "And while some folks up here are busy fighting for screen time," he said, "I'm fighting for people who have run out of time." A few senators dropped their gaze. The bill passed out of committee that day, with ease. Even some who had doubted Kennedy's approach voted yes. Reporters asked why afterward. One senator said plainly, "Because Kennedy reminded us why we're here." Meanwhile, Schiff was notably absent from the vote. His office cited another conflict, but everyone knew the real reason. Weeks of backlash, silence, and failed spin had taken their toll. Schiff hadn't just lost a moment, he'd lost the audience. And in politics, losing the room is often worse than losing the vote. Later that day, a cartoon circulated online. It showed Kennedy planting a flag on a bridge while behind him lay broken microphones and empty news cameras. Schiff stood on the other side, shouting into the wind. Because in the end, Kennedy didn't have to win the debate. He'd already done something more powerful. He'd reminded people what it looks like to care, to serve, and to lead without spectacle. Weeks passed, but the impact didn't fade. Kennedy's insulin bill advanced through the Senate floor with strong bipartisan support, and a month later, it was signed into law. There were no fireworks, no parades, just real changes. Families reporting lower insulin prices, pharmacies updating signage, and parents in small towns finally breathing a little easier. Kennedy didn't hold a press conference. He didn't brag. He simply said, "It's a start," and got back to work. But in Washington, people noticed. What began as a personal insult had backfired so thoroughly that it reshaped the public image of both men. Schiff, once seen as polished and eloquent, now carried a reputation for arrogance, for being out of touch. Kennedy, once dismissed as theatrical, had become one of the most effective and grounded voices in the Senate. Pundits were forced to reevaluate. A popular podcast host said it best, "Kennedy didn't win because he clapped back. He won because he didn't." He stayed calm, he told the truth, and he showed that you don't have to scream to be heard, you just have to care. In a final effort to recover, Schiff released a congratulatory statement after Kennedy's bill passed. But it rang hollow. Too late. Too calculated. The public had already moved on, and they'd already decided who they trusted. Meanwhile, Kennedy continued his town hall tour. No media alerts, no production teams, just folding chairs, handshakes, and conversations. He brought the same folder, the same letters. Some people cried, others simply said, "Thank you." And then one afternoon near Baton Rouge, a young girl approached him with a folded piece of paper. It was notebook paper, torn at the edge. She handed it to him and said, "Thank you for reading my letter. You made me feel important. My mom said you gave us hope." Kennedy smiled and gently tucked the note into his folder, right next to the others. Bookmark. He looked at the crowd, small, sincere, and quiet, and said, "Washington likes to pretend it's a stage, but I'm not here to act. I'm here to serve, and I'll keep doing that until the day they show me the door." That moment didn't make national headlines, but it didn't need to. Because the people who were there, they understood exactly what he meant. In the end, Schiff's insult didn't destroy Kennedy, it defined him, but not in the way Schiff had intended. What started as an insult became a turning point. Kennedy didn't fight fire with fire, he used truth, humility, and purpose. And in the process, he reminded America what real leadership looks like. If this story made you think differently, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because the moments that matter most aren't always the loudest, they're the ones that leave something behind.